The galaxy's deadly misstep, crossing. One protected by Earth. The moment the Kareth soldier shoved me, I knew exactly what was going to happen. Next, not because I was angry, not because I planned to do something about it myself, but because I had already pressed the button on my uplink before. His hand even left my shoulder, and now all I had to do was wait. My name is Cal Marin. I am a diplomatic liaison for Earth's consular division. I have been stationed at Tesavara Crossroads for 14 months, and in that time I have processed 943 asylum applications, mediated 11 trade disputes, and attended more council dinners than I care to count. I am not a soldier. I do not carry a weapon. My job is paperwork, patience, and presence. The girl's name was Sina. She was Valhari, which meant she was small, barely reaching my chest, with skin that shifted between pale silver and soft gold depending on her mood. Right now it was ash gray, which I had learned meant fear. She had arrived at Tesavara 6 weeks earlier with nothing except a cracked data card and a registration number from a refugee processing center 3 systems away. I had been working on her asylum papers. For 3 of those 6 weeks, we had spoken every few days. She liked asking me questions about Earth, the kind of questions that made me think she had been reading about it, secretly building a picture in her mind of a place she had never seen. She had asked me once whether it was true that Earth had ocean that covered most of the planet's surface. I told her yes. She went quiet for a moment, and then she said she had never seen an ocean. She said where she came from, water was collected in underground cisterns and rationed by household. She said she used to dream about water that had no edges. I thought about that when the Kareth soldiers walked into the central promenade of Tesavara Crossroads at approximately 1400 station hours and went directly to the bench where Sina was sitting, waiting for me to bring her the latest update on her paperwork. There were 6 of them. Kareth enforcement officers wore dark gray tactical suits with red trim on the shoulder plates, and they moved the way people move when they are very certain that no one in the room is going to stop them. The lead officer was taller than they others, with a jaw like a block of stone and eyes that had the flat professional calm of someone who had done this many times before. The promenade was busy. Hundreds of beings from dozens of species moved through the wide open corridor past food stalls and information terminals and the low hum of a commerce district that never fully slept. They all noticed the soldiers. Most of them kept walking. I was 30 m away when I saw Sina stand up from her bench. I could see even from that distance that her skin had gone completely gray. The lead officer reached her before I could. He said something to her in Kareth dialect that I could not fully hear, but I caught the words for property and jurisdiction and hegemony decree. He produced a binding cord and reached for her wrist. I was moving before I had made any conscious decision to move. I pushed through the crowd. Someone stepped aside. Someone else did not, and I went around them. I reached the officer just as he was fastening the binding cord around Sina's wrist, and I put myself between them and the direction they were walking. I am Cal Marin, I said. Earth diplomatic liaison, Tesavara consular division. This individual is registered under Earth consular protection, case number 774 Alpha 9. You are required to halt this action pending review. The officer looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture that has inconveniently placed itself in your path. Earth, he said. Yes, I said. He looked at the other soldiers. One of them made a small sound that might have been a laugh. We've heard the name, he said. It means nothing. Then he put his hand on my chest and pushed me back 2 steps. Not a strike. Not a threat, just a dismissal, the kind of push you give something that is in your way. Sina looked at me. Her eyes were enormous. Her skin had gone so pale it was almost white. I straightened my jacket. I reached into my front pocket and pressed the uplink. It was a small device, not much bigger than my thumb, and it made no sound when I activated it. I spoke into it quietly in the flat, neutral tone that the consular division trained us to use in exactly these situations. This is Liaison Marin Station. Tesavara. Incident Code Omega 7. Consular Protection Breach Category 1. Subject Sina Velhari, Case 774 Alpha 9. Physical interference with liaison. Personnel confirmed, time stamping now. The lead officer had already turned away. He and his team were walking Sina toward the far corridor, and she was moving with them because the binding cord gave her no choice, and her head was turned back toward me, watching. I found an empty bench against the wall and sat down on it. A Tesseveran merchant named Orvis, who I had dealt with several times at the trade desk, had been watching the whole thing from a stall nearby. He walked over carefully, like someone approaching a fire that he was not sure was finished burning. What was that? He asked, looking at the corridor where the soldiers had gone. What did you just do? I made a phone call, I said. What does that mean? I checked my uplink. The transmission had been received and acknowledged. Somewhere right now, a duty officer, the Earth Consular Emergency Division, was reading an incident report with the words Omega 7 at the top of it. A set of pre-authorized protocols had just been activated. Decisions were already being made by people far above my clearance level. It means I told them what happened, I said. It means they know. Orvis looked uncertain. Know what? Exactly. The Karath have legal jurisdiction over Velhari persons under their expansion decree. The Galactic Council has not yet ruled against it. What can Earth do? I looked at the empty bench where Sina had been sitting 40 minutes ago. Before any of this happened, she had been reading something on a small data screen. I had been on my way to tell her that 2 of her 3 required documents had cleared. I had been looking forward to seeing her face when I told her. They said my name means nothing, I said. Does it? Orvis asked, and I could tell he was genuinely asking. He was not being unkind. He simply did not know. I looked at the deep-range sensor display mounted on the far wall of the promenade, the one that showed incoming and outgoing traffic for the station. It updated in real time. I had been watching it for a while now out of habit. I watched it for another minute. Then the display changed. The first signature appeared at the edge of the sensor range, then another, then several more arriving from different vectors, all of them moving toward Tesavara at a speed that the display struggled to calculate cleanly, because it was not used to seeing that many ships move that fast in coordinated formation. Orvis saw it too. He had gone very still. What is that? He said. That, I said, is what my name means. The stars outside the viewport of the Iron Mandate had not changed. They never did. Commander Usha had spent 22 years looking at stars from the bridges of Kareth enforcement vessels, and in all that time they had remained exactly what they were: cold, distant, indifferent. The universe did not care about the affairs of species. It simply continued. Usha was a practical man. He had built his career on practicality. He did not like sentiment, and he did not like complications, and he especially did not like the kind of situations that required him to fill out more paperwork than the mission originally called for. This mission had been simple: locate the Velhari subject, confirm her identity against the hegemony's expansion, jurisdiction register, detain her under Section 14 of the Territorial Consolidation Act, return her to hegemony processing for resettlement assignment. Simple, clean, legal by every standard. The hegemony recognized the Earth liaison had been an unexpected variable. Usha had known there was an Earth consular presence at Tesavara, but Earth was a gray world. They filed complaints. They sent strongly worded transmissions through official channels. Sometimes they showed up at Galactic Council sessions and gave speeches that the other delegates sat through politely and then ignored. They were a species that had achieved interstellar travel only 2 centuries ago, that had not yet claimed a single star system beyond their own, and that had no meaningful alliance structure in any of the major galactic factions. The liaison had pressed some kind of device. Usha had noted it but had not considered it significant. Now, sitting in the command chair of the Iron Mandate, watching his sensor officer's posture change in a way that Usha had learned over 2 decades to pay attention to, he began to reconsider. "Commander," said Sensor Officer Tren, in a voice that was trying very hard to be professionally neutral and not quite succeeding. "We have incoming signatures, multiple." "How multiple?" Usha said. Tren looked at his board, looked at it again. 17 confirmed so far, still resolving. Usha sat forward. "From which direction?" "That's the thing, sir. They're not coming from one direction. They're converging from 7 separate vectors." Usha stood up. Converging from multiple vectors meant coordination. It meant pre-planning. It meant someone had already known where the Iron Mandate was going to be and had already calculated the intercept geometry before the incident at Tesavara had even happened, which meant either they had been watching or they had prepared response protocols for exactly this kind of situation, which was a very different and significantly more uncomfortable thing. "What are they?" he asked. "Military classification." "Mixed," said Tren. "Lead vessel is broadcasting as Earth diplomatic. Registry, ASF Covenant diplomatic. Cruiser class, but the vessels behind it are not diplomatic. 2 destroyer class. 1 carrier configuration, 4 support craft. The other vessels are still resolving, but Commander," he paused, "the carrier is very large." Usha said nothing for a moment. He stood at the viewport and looked at the stars, which had not changed, and thought about Section 14 of the Territorial Consolidation Act, and thought about the Velhari girl sitting in the holding cell below decks, and thought about the Earth liaison who had spoken into a small device with the flat, calm voice of someone who was not surprised by what was happening. Open a channel to the Earth vessel, he said. They've already opened one to us, said Communications Officer Bren, there. Waiting. Usho straightened his uniform. He had very good posture and he knew it, and in moments of uncertainty he used it. He nodded to Bren and the main display shifted from the sensor grid to a transmission feed. The woman on the screen was perhaps 60 years old. She had white hair cut short and a face that had accumulated a significant number of years in a way that did not make it weaker. She was wearing a dress uniform, dark blue with Earth's insignia at the collar, and she was sitting in a command chair on the bridge of the Asf Covenant. With her hands folded in her lap, her name appeared in text at the bottom of the display, Admiral Petra Voss, Earth Strategic Deployment Force. She did not raise her voice. She did not lean forward. She simply looked at Usho with the patient, unhurried expression of someone who had already made all the relevant decisions and was now simply communicating them. Commander, she said, I am Admiral Voss of the Earth Strategic Deployment Force. You currently have in your custody of Velhari National, who is registered under Earth Consular Protection. I have reviewed the Tesavara incident footage, which was transmitted to us in full, including the physical contact made with our liaison officer. She paused for exactly 1 second. You have 4 hours to return her to the Tesavara Consular Bay unharmed and without conditions. After that, we begin a different kind of conversation. She did not explain what that meant. She did not need to. Usho kept his posture very straight. Admiral, the subject in question is under hegemony jurisdiction pursuant to the Territorial Consolidation Act. Section 14. Earth has no legal authority. We can discuss legal frameworks, Voss said pleasantly. During the 4 hours, I look forward to it. Voss out. The display returned to the sensor grid. Usho turned to his bridge crew. No one was looking at him. They were all looking at their stations with the focused intensity of people who are very carefully not reacting to something. He turned back to the viewport. Sensor grid now showed 23 incoming signatures, still resolving. Get me a line to Hegemony High Command, he said, priority channel. Then open the channel. Usho waited for the connection, watching the signatures multiply on the grid. He was a practical man. He had built his career on practicality, and the most practical thing he could think to do right now was to be very honest with the people above him. When the channel connected, he spoke carefully. This is Commander Usho of the Iron Mandate. I need to report a developing situation at Tesavara regarding the Velhari retrieval action. He took a breath. We may have made an error. The silence on the other end of the channel lasted 4 full seconds. Then the voice of Deputy Admiral Koff said, explain. Usho turned away from the viewport. He began to explain. Outside, the stars had still not changed, but the space between them was considerably more crowded than it had been an hour ago, and every new signature on the sensor board arrived from a slightly different direction, as if the people sending them wanted to make very certain that no matter which way you turned, you would see one. Below decks in the holding cell, the Velhari girl sat with her knees pulled up to her chest and her skin the color of ash. She did not know what was happening above her head. She only knew that the binding cord was cold, and the cell was quiet, and that, somewhere out there in a direction she could not identify, something had changed. She did not know what it was. She did not know that 23 ships were moving through the dark toward the sound of one person's voice. She did not know that a man had sat down on a bench and pressed a button and spoken 2 sentences, and that those 2 sentences were now the most important thing in this region of space. She pulled her knees tighter and waited. I had never been on the Covenant before. It was a diplomatic cruiser, which meant it was built to look impressive from the outside and functional from the inside, without any wasted space on comfort. The corridors were wide enough for 2 people to pass comfortably. The lighting was the kind of flat white that made everything look equally real, and the coffee in the officers' mess was bad in a specific institutional way that I had not tasted since my first year in the consular division. Admiral Voss was sitting across the briefing table from me with my incident report on the display in front of her, and a mug of the same bad coffee in her hand, and she was reading with the careful attention of someone who intended to read every word before saying anything. She had not asked me to summarize. She had not asked me to skip to the important parts. She was reading. Orvis was sitting in a chair against the wall. He had asked with what I thought was considerable courage given the circumstances whether he might be permitted to observe the debriefing on behalf of the Tesavara Trade Council. Voss had looked at him for a moment and then said yes, he could stay as long as he understood that this was not a performance and he was not here to ask questions until she said he could. He had agreed immediately and had been sitting very still against the wall ever since. I drank my coffee and waited. Outside the viewport, Tesavara Crossroads was visible at a distance, its rotating sections catching the light of the nearby star and arranged around it at distances that said present, without saying aggressive, were the Earth vessels. They were not pointed at anything in particular, they were just there. The Iron Mandate had not moved. Your paperwork on the Velhari girl was in order, Voss said finally, still looking at the display. Yes, I said. 3 weeks of processing, 2 independent document verifications, consular registration confirmed through the standard system. Correct. So the Kareth took someone who was legally by our own registration, under our protection. Yes. She set down the display and picked up her coffee mug. Walk me through your read of the situation, not the incident. The broader situation. What do the Kareth think Earth is? I had thought about this before. I thought about it the way you think about a puzzle that you encounter regularly and that you have never quite solved to your satisfaction. They think we are a gray world, I said, new to interstellar space, no territorial claims beyond our home system, no formal alliances with any of the major factions. They see our consular division as a bureaucratic formality, the kind of thing a species does when it wants to appear serious without actually being serious. And the protection registration, they think it is a form paperwork, something we file because it is the kind of thing young spacefaring civilizations do to feel relevant. They did not believe it meant anything because they have never seen it mean anything. I paused. They are not entirely wrong that most species treat it that way. Most species file protections that they have no capacity to enforce. But we do not, Orvis said from his chair against the wall. Then he caught himself and looked at Voss. I apologize. I understood I was not to ask questions. That was not a question, Voss said. Continue, Marin. I looked at Orvis. He was watching me with an expression that I had seen before on people encountering Earth's actual policy for the first time. It was a look of recalibration. The Karath have been expanding their territorial jurisdiction for 11 years. I said, in that time they have absorbed or displaced 23 smaller species. In most of those cases, other spacefaring powers filed complaints, expressed concern, attended council sessions, and eventually moved on. The Karath have learned from those experiences that concern costs nothing and means nothing. So they did not take us seriously. Orvis said. Then sorry, not a question. It's fine, Voss said. They did not take us seriously, I confirmed. They categorized Earth as a species with good intentions and no history. We have been in space for 2 centuries. Most of the major powers have been here for 1,000 years or more. To them we are young, we are unproven. And our protective posture is a policy statement, not a capability. Voss turned her coffee mug slowly in both hands, and yet here we are. Here you are, Orvis agreed quietly. Can I ask you something? I said to him. Voss nodded. When you saw the ships arriving on the sensor board at Tesavara, I said, what were you thinking? Orvis was quiet for a moment. He was a tall being, Tessavaran, with gray-blue skin and large eyes that were adapted for low-light environments, which meant that in the bright lighting of the briefing room he always looked slightly startled, but right now what he looked was thoughtful. I was thinking about the history, he said. I know some of Earth's history. I studied it briefly when your consular division first came to Tesavara because it seemed practical to understand who I might be dealing with. I read about your wars, the large ones. He paused. I want to ask you something, and I mean it genuinely, with no disrespect. Go ahead, I said. How does a species survive what Earth survived and come out like this? He said. Most species, after that level of sustained conflict across their own history, become either very isolated or very cautious. They build walls, they stop engaging, but Earth went in the opposite direction. Why? It was a good question. It was the question, really. I had thought about it before in quiet moments, the way you think about a thing that is so close to you that you can only see it clearly at an angle. When I was young, I said, my grandmother used to tell me about her grandmother who had lived through one of the worst periods in Earth's history. Not as someone who caused the suffering, as someone who watched it happen and did not act because acting seemed impossible and dangerous and other people's business. I looked at my coffee mug. She carried that for the rest of her life. Not what was done to her, what she didn't do, what she watched. The briefing room was quiet. Earth has a lot of those stories, I said, generation after generation of them, and at some point a very long time ago we started telling them differently, not as stories about the suffering, as stories about the watching, about the standing still, because we decided that was actually the more dangerous part. Orvis was very still. So when you see someone being dragged away in binders, he said slowly, and no one is moving to stop it. It is not a foreign situation, I said. It is a familiar one, and we have a very strong, very old, very deeply held opinion about how familiar situations like that are supposed to end. Voss set down her coffee mug. She had been listening without looking at either of us, and now she looked at me. That's the diplomatic version, she said. What's the other version? Orvis asked. We got very, very good at conflict, Voss said, because it kept finding us, whether we wanted it or not, and at some point good at conflict means you need somewhere to point it that you can live with. She looked at Orvis. This is somewhere we can live with. The briefing room was quiet again. Somewhere in the ship a distant mechanical hum marked the passage of time. The 4-hour window, I said, has it expired? Voss looked at the display on the table. She looked at it for a long moment. 10 minutes ago, she said. She stood up, picked up her coffee, and walked toward the door. The Kareth have not responded, I said. It was not quite a question. No, she said, they have not. She stopped at the door and looked back at Orvis, who had not moved from his chair. You can stay if you like, she said. The next part is worth watching. Then she walked out and the door closed. And Orvis and I sat in the briefing room with the bad coffee and the viewport showing Tessavara and the fleet and the Iron Mandate, which had still not moved. I finished my coffee. It was, as always, terrible. Is she always like that? Orvis asked. I've never met her before today, I said. You seemed very calm, he said, for someone who had just been pushed by a soldier and was waiting to see whether a fleet would show up. I knew they would show up, I said. How? I thought about it. It was not exactly a function of certainty, it was something else. The same thing my grandmother's grandmother had carried in reverse. Knowledge so old and so settled that it did not produce anxiety, it produced patience. Because I know what my name means, I said. Outside the viewport, something in the formation of the Earth vessels shifted. Not aggressively, just a repositioning. The kind that said clearly and without any words that a set of very patient people had just run out of patience. My name is Alara Orvis, and I have been a Tessavaran Diplomatic Council representative for 60 years. I have seen civilizations negotiate, threaten, posture, retreat, and occasionally surprise me. I thought at 60 years that I had developed a reasonably accurate model of how these things work. The next 11 minutes made me revise that model considerably. It began with a transmission from the Kareth. After the 4-hour window expired, after I had sat with Kale Marin in the briefing room drinking terrible coffee and watching the viewport, a message came through from the Iron Mandate. It was not a surrender, it was not a negotiation. It was a document, 63 pages long, transmitted in formal hegemony legal format, citing 17 separate precedents in Galactic Council jurisprudence and asserting that the Velhari subject was under hegemony, sovereign jurisdiction, pursuant to the Territorial Consolidation Act, that Earth's consular protection registration was inapplicable under the jurisdictional hierarchy established by Council Resolution 447B, and that any interference with the lawful exercise of hegemony authority would constitute an act of aggression under interstellar law. It was, I have to admit, an impressive document. The hegemony had clearly prepared it in advance or had access to a legal team that could produce it very quickly. It cited the right precedents It used the correct terminology. It would have taken at least 3 to 6 months to work through the Galactic Council's dispute resolution process. I read it on a borrowed terminal in the briefing room and thought, this is how these things normally work. This is the grammar of interstellar power. You file a document, the other side files a counter document. Years pass. Earth did not file a counter document. What they transmitted instead was 2 pages. I say 2 pages, but that is not quite accurate. It was 2 pages of a specific kind of content, and that content was a list, not an argument, not a legal rebuttal, a list. It was a list of every Karath trade route that passed through Earth. Registered freight corridors, a list of every Karath financial instrument that was denominated through Earth-partnered banking registries, a list of every Karath infrastructure contract that involved materials certified through Earth-aligned supply chains. It included a specific notation for each entry, indicating the legal mechanism by which Earth could, if it chose, suspend, restrict, or redirect the relevant arrangement. It did not say that Earth would do any of these things. It simply presented the information. 2 pages. I read it twice to make sure I understood it. Then I sat quietly for a moment, recalibrating again. The Karath had, over the course of their expansion, connected themselves to a significant portion of galactic trade infrastructure. They had done this because it was profitable and sensible, and because the entities through which they had connected had seemed at the time to be neutral, minor, commercially focused. Earth's consular division, Earth's freight registry, Earth partnered banking structures, none of these had seemed at the time like points of leverage. They had seemed like bureaucracy. Bureaucracy, I was learning, was a different thing depending on who was running it. But what happened next was the part that changed everything. Admiral Voss opened a public channel. Not a channel to the Iron Mandate, not a channel to Hegemony High Command. Public channel broadcasting to every vessel, every station terminal, and every communications receiver within range. I watched it happen from the terminal in the briefing room and felt something shift in my understanding of what was happening. She appeared on screen, the same steady presence I had seen in the briefing, and she read a short statement. She said that the Earth Strategic Deployment Force was present at Tesavara in response to a confirmed breach of consular protection affecting a registered individual. She said that Sina Velhari, case number 774, Alpha 9, had been registered under Earth consular protection in accordance with Treaty Framework 7.2 of the Earth Interstellar Relations Act. She said that under that framework all registered individuals were afforded the same protection consideration as Earth nationals abroad. She cited the specific articles. She invited anyone listening to look it up. Then she closed the broadcast. I sat with the terminal for a moment. Then I started looking at the station communication network. Tesavara Crossroads handled traffic from more than 90 registered species on any given day. Most of them were commercial operators, small traders, transporters, representatives of species that did not have powerful navies or strong alliance structures, the kinds of species that were in the ordinary grammar of galactic power, considered background. They were pulling up the Earth consular Protection Treaty. I watched the access logs on the public network and saw request after request coming in from terminals across the station, from vessels docked at the outer rings, from communications nodes that served routes between here and dozens of other systems. They were looking it up, and some of them, I realized as I followed the access patterns, were not just reading it. They were checking whether they were on the list. The Earth Consular Protection Registry was public. Anyone could look at it. I had looked at it before, years ago, and found it unremarkable. A few hundred registrations, mostly Velhari and a handful of other displaced species. It had seemed like a diplomatic gesture, the kind of thing you did to appear engaged without committing to anything substantial. What I saw, looking at it now with different eyes, was something else. It was small, but it was not nothing, and every being on that list now knew, watching what was happening outside Tesavara, what their registration actually meant. I thought about what Maron had told me in the briefing room about his grandmother's grandmother, about the watching and the standing still. I thought about the 63-page Karath legal document and the 2-page Earth response. And then I thought about something that I had not considered before, which was that perhaps the public broadcast had not been spontaneous. Perhaps it had been the point. Perhaps the entire visible response, the fleet positioning, the 2-page list, the public citation of treaty articles, had been designed not just to resolve this specific situation, but to ensure that when it was resolved, every species in range would know exactly how it had been resolved and exactly what had made the difference. 38 minutes after the public broadcast, the Iron Mandate opened a channel to the Covenant. Commander Usha appeared on screen. He looked, I thought, like a man who had made a series of calculations in a short period of time and had not enjoyed the results of any of them. We are prepared to transfer the Velhari. Subject, he said, under protest and pending formal council review of the jurisdictional question. Of course, Voss said. Thank you, Commander. We will receive her at the station Consular Bay. The channel closed. In the holding cell of the Iron Mandate, Sina did not yet know she was about to be released. She was sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, waiting in the particular way that people wait when they have learned that waiting is the only thing available to them. The binding cord was removed by a Karath officer who did not look at her or speak to her. He simply walked in, unfastened the cord, and walked out. She sat for another minute, not sure what had changed. Then a different officer came in and told her she was being transferred. The shuttle bay of the Covenant was large and clean and bright. Sina stepped out of the transfer vessel into it and stood there, blinking in the light, holding a blanket that someone had given her. She was so small. She looked around at the bay, at the Earth crew standing at a professional distance, at the walls with their clean utilitarian lines, and her skin shifted from ash gray to something approaching silver. I watched it happen from the observation window above the bay. Maron was in the bay. He walked over to her, not quickly, not with drama, and said something that I could not hear. Through the observation window, she said something back. Her skin went a slightly warmer color, not gold, not yet, but moving toward it. I stayed at the window for a while, watching. After a time, I was joined by a small delegation of station representatives, who had apparently been waiting for exactly this moment. 2 of them were from species I recognized as having particularly difficult relationships with the Karath. They were looking at the bay at Sina, at the Earth crew moving around her with practiced efficiency. One of them said to me quietly, "The registration list, is it open?" "Yes," I said, "it is public." "How does one apply?" I looked at him. He was from a species called the Tarath, small and low gravity, adapted from a system that the Karath expansion had been moving toward for the past several years. His people did not have a navy. They did not have allies among the major powers. They had apparently been paying attention today. "I can find out," I said. I sent a message to Marin's uplink. He responded within 2 minutes with a link to the Earth Consular Division's registration portal and a note that said processing times are currently running 3 to 4 weeks. We are working on reducing that. I showed it to the Tarath representative. He read it carefully, then he saved it to his personal device. Behind him, 2 others leaned over to read it as well. Outside the viewport of the bay observation window, the Earth fleet maintained its position around Tesavara. Crossroads, not triumphant, not threatening, simply present. The Iron Mandate had begun its departure sequence. Its running lights moved slowly away from the station and toward the open space beyond the sensor range. It did not look back. I am Marin, and this is the part where I tell you what happened after 6 months after Tesavara. I am at a station called Verath Junction, which is 6 systems from Tesavara and considerably less glamorous. It is primarily a transit hub for commercial freight operators, and my work here involves processing shipping documentation, mediating minor disputes between freight registries, and attending with some regularity events that the station council calls diplomatic receptions, and that I would describe as rooms full of beings eating mediocre food and talking about logistics. It is ordinary work. It is exactly the kind of work I have always done, and I find it in an honest and uncomplicated way worthwhile. Sina is on Arathis 4. It is a colony world in Earth's partnership network, in a temperate zone with 2 rivers and a coastline that faces a warm sea. There is a Velhari resettlement community there of about 400 people, most of them displaced by the same hegemony expansion actions that had displaced Sina. She has been there for 5 months. She sent me a message 3 weeks ago. It was short. It said that she had learned to swim. She said the ocean was very large and that it went on in every direction without stopping, and that the first time she had seen it, she had stood at the edge of the water for a very long time before stepping in, because she had spent her whole life being careful about water, and it was difficult at first to believe that there was enough. She said that now she went every morning. I read that message several times at different times of day over the course of a week. I want to tell you about the registry numbers because they are the part of the story that surprised me most. In the month after the Tesavara incident, Earth's consular protection registry grew by 12%. That was notable, but not extraordinary. Registration numbers had grown after other high-profile incidents before. In the second month, the growth was 30%. That was higher than any previous comparable period. By the 6th month, the total growth stood at 340%. 340%. In 6 months, the consular division had to hire. They opened new processing centers on 3 Earth-partnered stations. They developed a streamlined registration protocol for species with limited documentation infrastructure. They assigned additional liaison officers to high-demand regions. I will tell you what I think happened. Before Tesavara, the protection registry was an option that most small species knew about in the same way you know about a tool you have never seen used. You know it exists, you are not sure it works, you have no particular reason to believe that pulling it off the shelf will produce anything other than noise and paperwork. After Tesavara, the tool had been used in view of a significant portion of the galactic community, and its output had been documented and transmitted publicly, and the species who watched it happen had been given, by Admiral Voss's deliberate public broadcast, every piece of information they needed to understand what the tool was and how to access it. 340%. Alara Orvis sent me a report on the broader political effects in the Tesavara region. The Karath expansion had slowed, not stopped, but slowed in the systems. Earth held consular agreements, hegemony strategic planning documents, which had been leaked to several council-adjacent intelligence services, apparently contained a new risk category that had not existed in their planning framework before Tesavara. The category was labeled, according to the reports, something that translated roughly from Karath as Earth-adjacent populations. I found that remarkable, not because I did not expect it, but because of the specific language: not Earth-defended, not Earth-allied, Earth-adjacent, meaning near enough to Earth's network of relationships that an action against them might produce a response. It was a category that was expanding. The most notable political development in the 6 months after Tesavara involved a small species called the Tarith. They are a low-gravity adapted species from a binary star system with no military to speak of, with a history of maintaining neutrality through careful diplomatic positioning, and frankly through being small enough that larger powers had not previously found them worth the effort of bothering. The Karath expansion had been moving toward their system. 22 weeks after Tesavara, the Tarith completed their registration through Earth's Consular Protection Framework. 317 individuals and institutions across 7 Tarith population centers. They published the registration publicly, which they were not required to do but chose to do. The Karath expansion route that had been trending toward their system was rerouted 2 weeks later. Hegemony planning documents cited logistical reconsideration. Independent analysts cited Tesavara. I do not claim that Earth can protect everyone. I do not claim that the registry is an impenetrable shield or that registration guarantees safety. All circumstances. The galaxy is large and complicated, and there are forces in it that do not respond to the kind of pressure Earth can apply. But I think about what the Taxkalan representative said to Orvis in the observation bay that day after watching Cine cross into the Covenant's shuttle bay. Is the list open? 3 words: is the list open? Not can Earth fight our wars, not will you defend us if we are attacked, not even do you care about us. Just is the list open? Because what they had seen was not a military demonstration, though the Military had been present. What they had seen was documentation, accountability. A species that kept its word in a visible and verifiable way, and what they wanted was access to the same thing. I think about my grandmother sometimes, and about the story she carried, the weight of watching, the specific texture of inaction when action was possible. I think about how that story traveled down through generations, not as trauma exactly, but as instruction, as a calibration. This is what it feels like to watch and do nothing. Remember this feeling, note it in your body so that when you encounter it again, you will recognize it quickly. Here is what I think happened at Teixcalon, at a level deeper than the fleet positioning and the legal documents and the registry numbers. The Teixcalon looked at Earth and saw bureaucracy and patience and paperwork, and a species too young to have established itself. They saw something they had seen before, many times, in the faces of species that filed complaints and attended council sessions and eventually moved on. They saw watchers. They were wrong. We are not watchers. We learned at very high cost over a very long time how to stop being watchers. It is not a natural state for us any more than it is natural for most species. It is something we practice deliberately, the way you practice anything that does not come easily. We built institutions around it. We train people in it. We wrote it into policy frameworks and diplomatic protocols and the specific trigger conditions that cause a duty officer in an emergency division to activate an Omega-7 response at 1400 station hours. We made it structural because we knew that individuals are inconsistent and circumstances are unpredictable, and if you want a behavior to persist across time and circumstance, you cannot rely on courage alone. You have to build the behavior into the system. That is what the Kareth did not know. That is what most of the galaxy does not know yet. They see the fleet and they think Earth has a military. What they should be thinking is, Earth built this entire system on a specific decision about what kind of species they wanted to be, and then spent 2 centuries making that decision difficult to reverse. It was early morning at Varath Junction, which meant the station system had shifted to a slightly warmer tone to simulate dawn, which I have always found charming in a small institutional way. I was at my desk with a cup of coffee. That was by a narrow margin better than the coffee on the Covenant. I was reading Orvis's report and a summary of the Tarath situation and a message from the consular division about the expanded registration protocols. Then my terminal flagged an incoming alert from the Galactic Alert Sharing network that Earth participates in through 3 different bilateral agreements. It was a report from a station called Orth Deep 9 Systems from Varath Junction, which I had never been to, but which I knew from maps as a mid-sized commercial hub in a region where 3 different expanding powers had been quietly, carefully repositioning their influence for the past 4 years. The alert described an incident involving a registered consular protection subject. The details were still coming in. The subject was a being from a species I did not recognize offhand, which meant they were probably from one of the smaller systems that had registered in the past 6 months. They were in difficulty. Someone had decided that their registration was not a meaningful obstacle. I read the alert twice. Then I picked up my uplink. I thought about Cena standing at the edge of an ocean that had no edges. Learning that there was enough water, I thought about 340%. I thought about a list that was open. I pressed the transmission button and spoke in the flat, calm voice that the Consular Division trained us to use in exactly these situations. "This is Liaison Marin," I said. "Station Varath Junction, incident code Omega 7. I paused for a moment. They touched one of ours. Outside the station viewport, the freight traffic of Varath Junction moved. In its ordinary, unhurried way, ships arriving and departing along routes that had existed for centuries. The stars were cold and distant and indifferent. The stars always are. But somewhere in that dark, moving along, pre-calculated vectors toward a set of coordinates that had just been flagged. On an emergency response grid, something was already turning. It always was. That was the point.